Welcome back to Second Breakfast and the wide world of Westeros. We're continuing our Game of Thrones book club today with Bran Chapter 4. He's finally awoken from his chroma?
Oh no, his chroma.
So we've got a lot of fun imagery and guest stars and fun stuff to dig into. But before we get into that, I do need to say that we discussed a barn burner of a chapter in our Fire and Blood coverage over on Patreon. We're doubling up on George R. R. Martin right now to prep for House of the Dragon Season 2. We're talking about the relevant chapters from George's fake history of the Targaryen dynasty.
How dare you?
Fire and Blood. So that's 7 chapters that will be adapted across the 3 or 4 seasons of the show. And we just did our 3rd episode talking about Fire and Blood. And we officially passed where the show went in Season 1. Oh boy.
Ooh, it was a fun one.
Season 2 is going to start strong.
Yeah.
So, pun not intended. So check that out over on Patreon. Really fun discussion. Just like these, but different content.
Also a little more unhinged.
Yes, a little more unhinged. Thank God for Patreon.
Thank goodness.
All right.
Cool.
Shall we?
Let's do it. Let me give a quick recap of this chapter and we can dive in. This was another doozy full of dreams and symbolism and all that fun stuff. So I had a real ball with this one. So this is Bran number 4. Reminder, we have seen the show and read the books already, so we're going to spoil everything. Okay. So Bran has been awake for, it seems like a few weeks now. It's not like the next day. Like he's been awake and he's basically just he's upset that he's trapped inside. He's listening to old Nan tell stories over and over again while his brothers are outside, sword fighting and running with the wolves and, having a great time in his eyes. So we learn a bit more about old Nan. We've heard of her before. She's presumably like this sort of like wet nurse nanny person that's been in their lives, but we learn a bit more about her here. She's a very, very old woman. I think the narration says she might be the oldest person in Westeros, which is pretty cool. And she's been at Winterfell for generations. And she was called Old Nan when Ned was a child. She kind of gets confused about how long she's actually been there and which was her son and who she took care of and all this stuff. But she's been here for a long time. We also learned that in this period when Bran has been awake, Robb has been trying his best to be Lord of Winterfell. He's practicing swordplay all the time. He is often poring over account books with Maester Luwin. He's visiting holdfasts and stuff, so he's trying his best. Because remember, Catelyn's still not back, so it's just them there. And then, of course, meanwhile, Rickon is just confused as ever. Doesn't know what's going on.
He's a baby.
He's 3. Yeah, every time Robb goes to visit a holdfast for more than a day, Rickon's like, is Robb ever coming back? Poor kid. His whole family has left him. So that's rough. And Bran's having, the worst time because he's paralyzed and he can't do anything. And he complains to old Nan that he hates her stories. And he's like, I only like the scary stories. Your stories suck. And so she says, well, she's so funny. She is such she does not care, because she's so old and nothing offends her anymore. So she's like, well, I've got a story for you. And so she tells Bran a story about winter and about what that's like and about the long night, which is this time that happened thousands of years ago when the winter lasted so long that it got so cold that it was just nighttime for eons, for a long time. A lot of people died. And then she mentions the others and she mentions the White Walkers. And so then she goes into the story about, this is before the Andals came, this is long time ago in Westeros, when this person who's called the Last Hero is looking for the children of the forest, if there are any left, because the White Walkers have come and killed everybody. And he's hoping to find the children of the forest to sort of use their magic to undo what the others have done. But he goes out to find them, and slowly the others pick off his companions, his dog, his horse, and finally him. And then right when she's getting to the end of the story, old Nan is cut off because Maester Luwin comes in. And he says, hey, Tyrion Lannister is here and he wants to talk to you, Bran. Remember, Tyrion was at the wall. Now he's back. And we also meet another character here, Hodor. We've seen Hodor before. We learn more about Hodor. Hodor is related to old Nan somehow. I don't think he's her son, but he's some distant relative of hers. Or not even distant. He's related to her. He's about 7 feet tall. He's very, very strong. And he's very simple-minded. He only knows one word, Hodor. Hodor is not even his real name. His real name is Walder. And they wonder where Hodor came from. Of course, we know. But it's a nice little introduction to who this guy is. And he's sort of been helping carry Bran around because Bran can't walk.
We know he's a DJ from Australia.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Do you remember that? How scandalized the internet was when they saw him with his earring?
It was deeply upsetting for all of us. Anyway, so that's Hodor. So Tyrion is here, and Bran gets down to the hall where everybody is. And Robb is pretty unhappy to see Tyrion. I had to remind myself, Robb does not yet know about the plot against Bran. He doesn't know that it was Tyrion who presumably ordered the assassination attempt on Bran, but he's still not happy to see Tyrion because Robb's not feeling very like Lannister friendly at the moment. So he's kind of being a little snarky to Tyrion, and Tyrion, very cleverly kind of puts him in his place and says like, listen, I'm here to like help you, because he has created a design for a saddle for Bran to use so that he can ride a horse. Tyrion says it's actually very similar to the type of saddle that he has to use because Tyrion can't. It seems like they control their horses with their legs in this world, and Tyrion obviously can't do that because his legs are too short, and then Bran wouldn't be able to either. So he's like, get a young horse, do this right kind of saddle, and then learn to control the horse with reins instead of with your legs. Also in this conversation, Tyrion asks Bran if he remembers anything from his fall, and Bran says he doesn't. We'll get back to that later. And then Rickon comes in, and he's got the 3 direwolves with him. He's got Shaggy Dog, his own dog, Summer, who is Bran's dog, or wolf, and then Greywind, who is Robb's wolf. And they all kind of like growl, and they don't like how Tyrion smells, and they all kind of jump onto like to attack Tyrion all at once. Bran and Robb both call their wolves off, and then so does Rickon after he kind of like gets it together. Remember, he's 3. Tyrion is, of course, terrified, but unharmed. And then he's like, okay, I'm going to leave. Like, I don't need to stay here. There's a nearby inn. I'll stay there for the night, and then I'll head off to King's Landing tomorrow. Thanks. Good to see you. And also the guys who came with Tyrion, some of them are some of the Night's Watch brothers who kind of escorted Tyrion down to Winterfell. So they're going to stay at Winterfell, but Tyrion's going to go stay at an inn. And then later, it doesn't seem like it's nighttime. I think it's just that afternoon. Bran takes a nap, basically. What else is he gonna do? And he has a dream, and in the dream he is climbing a tower that's like super 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 tall, and as he's climbing he sees some gargoyles who are watching over him and whispering, and Bran knows that if he doesn't hear anything that they're whispering, he's going to be safe. But then the gargoyles kind of look at him and start coming after him anyway, and he realizes he's not safe, and then he wakes up. And then later that night, Robb, after dinner and stuff, Robb decides to take Bran up to bed himself, and Robb just is going through it. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know how to help Bran. He doesn't know how to do anything because he's 14 and doesn't know how to be Lord of Winterfell, even though he's trying his best. And he's just trying to like reassure Bran and reconnect with him, and says like, Mother is going to come home. How about when she gets here, we're going to get you a horse, and we'll greet her on horseback when she arrives, and she'll be so excited to see you on a horse. And then we'll go ride off to the wall and go visit Jon. It'll be a nice little adventure. And he's just trying really hard. And it's dark at this point, and Bran can hear that Robb is sort of crying and doesn't really know what to do. And that's where it ends. It's pretty sad. It's pretty rough.
Pretty beautiful. The way it ends.
Yeah.
This was an interesting chapter because I'm glad you hit so much of this in the recap. I was feeling puckish reading this chapter. I was feeling insolent. Because there was such literary analysis catnip in this chapter.
Oh, sure.
The discussion of the others, the crow dreams, the symbolism, the multiple Bran Starks, all the imagery remixes of Bran's fall with the gargoyles being Cersei and Jaime, the White Walker legends, the last hero, the children of the forest. It was too much. So I don't want to talk about any of it. I'm sure you will, and that's fantastic.
I'm talking about most of that, so it's going to be great.
And that's why we do this together.
Exactly.
But for me, I was much more interested because for me it was just, okay, we have more legends and there's an ambiguous figure, and I wonder who the
Sure.
I didn't want to do that.
I understand.
The thing that really caught my attention in this chapter was what was happening underneath all of that, because I think there's sort of a crushing weight of mythology in this chapter.
Okay.
And underneath that is, for me, a much more rich and interesting character trend. And this is all about pretense and faking it. Judging, being judged, all of these social graces that weigh down and destroy people. Couple examples, couple counterexamples. Bran, at 8 years old, tells himself that he's too old to cry.
Oh my gosh, that really broke my heart. That was so sad.
In Bran's close, we're in his third person narration where it's a little bit colored by whoever the POV chapter is. He starts almost I mean, it's friendly, but it's a little mocking. He starts referring to Robb as Robb the Lord.
Yeah.
Talking about this persona that Robb has adopted.
Yes.
Trying to fill the shoes of their father.
Yeah, he can tell that's not who Robb really is, but he can tell it's a role Robb's trying to play.
And even Tyrion calls out Robb for his, quote, false courtesies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you have Tyrion. And I think he sort of doubles down on and flips this trend. Because it's not him pretending to be older and wiser and more regal. It's him being treated in a different way, right? There's pretense in the other direction.
Okay,
because we see him being treated like all the other Lannisters. When we know, and by the end of the chapter, Robb discovers, that Tyrion is very much his own man.
Yeah, yeah.
The counterexamples here, I think, sort of flesh out this discussion, because we have two really strong, divergent characters from this pretense-laden theme. Rickon. Rickon's having a hell of a time in this chapter with Shaggy Dog. And then he rocks in flanked by 3 direwolves.
He's like, what's up?
He's hanging out. He's having a great time. And the other counterexample is Hodor and his extraordinary kindness to Bran. Not making him feel like a burden. Treating him sweetly and gently. The word gentle is used 3 or 4 times in discussing Hodor's interactions with Bran. And both of those characters, they're totally at face value.
Yeah.
There's an incredible explicit nature to their dialogue or actions. There's no subtext for Rickon or Hodor. There's a total lack of pretense within each of these characters. It's a fascinating division from the endless inner turmoil that Bran, Robb, and Tyrion are going through.
Yeah, because they have the immaturity that doesn't really allow you to engage in any sort of pretense or falsity or trying to play any roles. That's the delightful thing about children is that they're so honest and open and unfiltered, and Hodor has that same quality. Yeah,
but I do think there is some intentionality to it with these characters. I don't know. I don't think it's incidental.
Sure. Yeah.
Because we're going to see these characters put through the ringer in 100 different circumstances, right? We're going to see Robb in all sorts of situations before his premature end.
Yeah.
And I think this chapter is an important building block on those journeys. It's not just dramatic contrast. I think that works, showing the distinction between these two sets of characters. But there's also a critique here. They're growing. We're seeing them almost at rest. Yes, they're stressed, but there's nothing really happening.
Yeah, no.
They have a visitor, they're dealing with it.
They're just really sad and lonely.
Yeah.
There's no imminent threat that they're aware of. We know from all the Catelyn and Ned chapters that almost like war is brewing, but they don't know that. They're just kind of feeling sad and a little abandoned and just kind of trying to get through.
And those spare idle moments, which are so rare in sweeping genre series like this, can be some of the most telling moments for characterization. And I loved seeing these 3 very different men wrestle with these social graces and etiquette and performance.
Yeah.
And so much of that is tied up into masculinity. The fact that all 3 examples and 2 counterexamples are all men coming at life in a very different way from each other. I really enjoyed the navigation of all of these. I mean, there was a Jane Austen quality. This was so much about how we think about how we compose ourselves.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And I think I learned a lot about these characters that you don't learn when they're charging into battle.
Of course not.
So I really appreciated this.
Yeah, I did too. And, like you said, there is a lot of fun, analysis, symbolism, fodder in here. And I think it is kind of fun to dive into it. But what you're sort of getting at, I think I sort of got to at the end as well. So I'll explain what I mean. I'll get there. The first thing that stuck out to me reading this was the first things that stuck out were the amount of 3-eyed raven connections. There are so many there. And we've been, unpacking these since Bran's first line of the book, which is the first chapter. But it was really present here, especially connecting to old Nan. That was kind of the anchor point here, because we have things it's describing summer. Bran's wolf, it says that he had eyes that saw all there was to see. I was like, yeah, okay, 3-eyed raven, duh, boom. But it got more interesting when old Nan was involved. She talks a lot about stories and their power here, and when I think about the 3-eyed raven, and I am a little rusty on 3-eyed raven lore, I haven't looked it up on purpose because I I don't know. I want to simultaneously think about this story with all of the knowledge of what happens, but also trying to go through it the way a first-time reader would as much as I can. So I'm trying not to look ahead too much. Sometimes I'll remind myself of some like Westerosi lore if I need to, but something like the Three-Eyed Raven, I don't want to like flip through A Dance with Dragons if I don't need to, right? So all that to say, I might be a little off on how the Three-Eyed Raven works, but the way I understand it is actually very similar to the Reverend Mother situation in Dune, right? Isn't it like they inherit all of the memories and knowledge from the past Three-Eyed Raven? Isn't that how it works?
Yeah, the experiences too.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about stories as being that thing that the Three-Eyed Raven inherits, that's sort of how I was thinking about this, because Old Nan says things like, my stories, no, not mine. The stories are before me and after me, before you too. As in, like, they're not centered around one person, but they are sort of ever present. But what was really interesting to me was she said, before me and after me, before you too, talking to Bran. So she doesn't say after Bran, only before Bran, which sort of I think is a nice little nod to when Bran becomes the Three-Eyed Raven, he will kind of remain so indefinitely. Like there's not going to be anything after Bran because he is after, you know?
Yes, it sort of works in both directions because we talked about the multiple Brans being referenced. So she could be talking to the original Bran the Builder.
Yes.
Like she's going as far back in history as is possible for these Brandon Starks, but also it works forwards.
Absolutely.
It's very efficient.
Yeah, because the line is she had lived so long that all the Brandon Starks had become one person in her head. The same way that the Three-Eyed Raven is one person, even if multiple people take on that identity over time.
It's like 007.
Yes, yeah. And also with stories, she says, stories wait, my little lord, and when you come back to them, why, there they are. And I want to connect this to another thing because a few pages later, it says, they left old Nan in the tower room with her needles and her memories. They call it memories and not stories, which is weird, I thought, because for the whole chapter, they're always talking about old Nan and her stories. She's telling stories. She's like, I have a story for this. Bran says, I hate your stories. Like, that's the word they're always using. And then when we leave old Nan, it says they left her to her with her needles and her memories. And then in the next scene, when Bran is talking to Tyrion, Tyrion's asking, do you remember anything from the fall? Maester Luwin says, the child does not remember anything of the fall. So remembering and memories and stories. And if we go back to old Nan saying that stories wait, and when you come back to them, why, there they are. Which to me says that the stories are memories, like they're one and the same. And when Bran becomes the Three-Eyed Raven, he will inherit and learn all of those stories and memories, but also that the memory of Bran's fall will come back to him, the way that stories are there for you to come back to them. So even though Bran right now can't remember anything about his fall or what he saw or heard with Jaime and Cersei, we can sort of assume that it will come back to him because stories are there when you come back to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it feels like a tip of the hat to subjectivity. And we've talked about this in the Fire and Blood episodes over on Patreon. I called that a false history in that it's not a real-time narrative. It's a maester parsing 3 different renditions of historical events and guessing at what actually happened at all of these integral moments.
Yeah.
But I think this is a continuation of that discussion in that all stories, which are usually in this world born of some sort of cultural myth or actual history, those are all impossibly colored by perception and the individual telling those stories. There's even a reference to Nan's stories changing in the telling, depending on how she's feeling or how good her memory is that day.
Right.
So there is a malleability to all of these stories. There isn't an objective history in this world, and memories are so immediately subjective that conflating memory and story, I think it's just a tip of the hat to that sort of unknowable factor.
Yeah, I really liked that. And then we also, get a hint that, of course, he's going to remember the events surrounding his fall or his throwing, because when he has that dream later, he's, climbing the tower, and the tower is described as a windowless tower, which sort of makes me think he can't recalled memories. He can't see inside of it just yet. But as he's climbing, he of course finds the gargoyles. And the gargoyles are described, it says, perhaps once they had been lions, but now they were twisted and grotesque. Of course, lions, Lannisters, the gargoyles here are Jaime and Cersei. Like, makes total sense. But the fact that they are creeping upon him and he's insisting that he didn't hear anything they said, but they're still coming after him, tells me that he's getting closer to remembering what he actually heard and saw. So that's a nice little hint there. But to add further to, you know, how we're meant to think about stories in this world, I was trying to unpack the story that Old Nan told, and I sort of painted myself into a corner, and I started to understand it in a different way. So she talks about the last hero who wanted to, again, find the children of the forest and undo what the others had done and basically save the world. And the quote says, "He set out into the dead lands with a sword, a horse, a dog, and a dozen companions. One by one, his friends died, and his horse, and finally even his dog, and his sword froze so hard the blade snapped when he tried to use it." So my instinct there was to try to, like, A equals B this setup and be like, okay, well, Bran's the hero, Summer is the dog, his horse is, I don't know, Hodor, because he carries him when they go out on their journey. And then I was like, who are the dozen companions? And man, I tried my best to figure out, are there like 12 people that are connected to Bran in some way? And there just aren't. I could name 12 characters, but none of them are like solely connected to Bran in a special way that doesn't include anybody else or anybody more, you know? And also, they don't all die. I was like, okay, well, how many POV characters are there? Okay, there are only 8 and they don't all die. How many Starks are there? Not 12, and they also don't all die. And I was like, well, what about Joran or whatever that kid's name is from Love Actually that he finds in the forest, and his female friend? What about Tonks from Harry Potter? Like, I was really trying to make it work and it wasn't working. And so then I thought, I think I'm reading this too literally. I don't think this is meant to be a one-to-one, this is Bran's prophecy kind of thing. Because then I even explored, maybe it's not Bran, maybe it's Jon. Jon goes out to try to like find a solution to the White Walker thing. But even then, his dog Ghost doesn't die. Does he have a horse? I don't even know. Like, it wasn't working. And so I sort of realized, I don't think it's meant to like directly reflect this story. I really think what it does, this story that Old Nan is telling, is that it gives color to the world, and it makes Bran, more importantly, long for adventure and heroic victory. We learn from the beginning of this book that Bran is really interested in the romanticism of like medieval chivalric knighthood, right? He wants to be a knight. He wants to go on adventures. He wants to ride a horse. Like, that's the thing that he cares about, because he's at the beginning 7 and now 8 years old. And that's what, like, especially because he's not going to be Lord of Winterfell because he's not the oldest son. Like, that's what he dreams about.
Being Rob's bannerman.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he likes, in the past, he liked to listen to Old Nan stories. He likes the legends and the tales and these, like, he likes the scary stories, like, presumably where, you know, somebody defeats the evil and like he wants to be that hero. And so what I think this story is doing is not giving us a direct like symbolic clue about what's going to happen to Bran, but I think it's more just helping us understand the nature of the world and the types of stories that people are interested in. Also gives us a little bit of lore about the history of Westeros, like thousands of years ago. And then it makes us think about what Bran wants. And it's really interesting that that is kind of shattered at the end of this chapter, because Robb is saying, like, we'll go on an adventure and we'll ride off to see Jon. And I think both Bran and Jon and Robb know that that's not going to happen.
The goalposts have moved.
Yeah. And so it feels, it's like that romanticism is futile and like is not reality. And that's what's so tragic.
I talked about this in my point. I was talking about the weight, the crushing weight of mythology. I think this is an extension of that. Because I read it as Lord of the Rings, right? It's a fellowship. It's a guy. It's Aragorn being the leader of that. And to a young boy, that is the ideal.
Of course.
That is the masculine ideal. That's how you want things to turn out. But that weight, the weight of that mythology, it can be crushing. In the same way we're talking about pretense and social expectation. And realizing that that is snatched away from you. When you're 8 and you're pretending, you're forcing yourself to be much older and more mature than you are, and you're scared shitless, and all these horrible things are happening to your family. You're feeling that weight. of masculinity, of that ideal, of this glowing golden future slip away from you.
Yeah,
and I think
sad.
that's, in some ways, that's him. I mean, he's like speedrunning puberty in this chapter as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and yeah, we've talked about this before. This fall, this transformation of Bran will not only like change him into a different kind of person and eventually into the Three-Eyed Raven, it's also just making him grow up more quickly. The same way that Robb is being forced to grow up a lot more quickly than he was really prepared for. The same way that Jon is being forced to grow up quickly. And we'll see this happen with Sansa and Arya too. Like, that's the tragedy of these children characters that are just being forced to zoom into adulthood way before they're ready, and it affects them all in different ways. Yeah. So yeah, it was fun to unpack the stories and then understand really what it means for the characters and less what it means for like the overall plot trajectory of everything.
I had a slightly related takeaway from Bran's relationship with these dreams and ideals.
Cool.
I was struck by how sticky the dreams were, how much they lingered in his thoughts, to the point that Bran seems to have trouble shaking off that crow interlude.
Yeah.
He has to, I mean, the beginning of the chapter is him verbally trying to dismiss this vision to get it out of his thoughts. And he does this again later with Hodor, when Hodor is standing there in the dark, and he has to say something to like make sure it's not the crow or the gargoyle are part of his visions.
Yeah.
He has to dismiss that. And I think quietly there's some seen and unseen there, just like you talked about the windowless tower in his dream and then the gargoyles with the burning eyes watching him.
Yeah.
There's some seen and unseen there, and him having to dismiss visions in his waking moments. There's almost a hallucinogenic quality there. But it seems like every time he's not actively working to get these visions out of his head, he recedes into them naturally.
Yeah.
And that grappling for an 8-year-old in his 4th chapter, we know he's going to be here through the duration. I feel like this is him already starting to become unglued from reality.
Yeah.
We talked about how the previous chapters really swiftly kickstarted his journey into becoming the Three-Eyed Raven. And I'm shocked at how fast we're progressing here, because already, I mean, it's like a Bootstrap Bill thing in the second Pirates of the Caribbean, where he's kind of becoming part of the ship, part of the crew.
Right.
We know from the way the show visualized the Three-Eyed Raven becoming part of that tree. I feel like Bran is already starting that process.
Yeah, and even when Old Nan is telling that big story at the end, he's so enraptured and engrossed in the story that when Maester Luwin comes in, it's actually very shocking, and it like snaps him out of it. And Bran is really getting wrapped up in the dreams, the stories, the memories. Yeah, you're right. It is completely distorting his reality, especially because like actual reality outside, he can't really join in on. Because he can't walk, he can't ride a horse, he has to be carried around. So usually he's just in bed listening to Old Nan tell stories all day. So that's his new reality.
He's becoming Old Nan. He's less of an active part of history and more of a chronicler, more of what he will eventually become,
of course,
which is the storyteller. Look at the way seen and unseen are becoming his identity. He spends the beginning of this chapter as the narrative camera watching things unfold as he is not present in the unfolding events. So he is unseen and he's limited to just watching things.
Totally.
I found this to be an interesting echo back to last chapter with how you talked about Viserys as a walking ghost.
Oh, yes.
And I think there's a similar sort of death happening for Bran here.
Wow. How sad. So maybe just like death of the old Bran. And, you know, because obviously Bran, the character, is not going away the way Viserys will, but yeah, the Bran as we knew him.
Neither of them will live up to what has always been their dreams.
That's
Viserys
true.
isn't going to take back the Seven Kingdoms, and Bran isn't going to be, Robb's noble bannerman.
Yeah. Oh, that's so sad.
It's a moving of the goalposts.
Oh, how tragic.
Yeah, I want to go back to another thing from last week, because I found an incredible resonance between last chapter and this chapter. So I've been talking for the past month or so about this resurgence of White Walker references. I feel like they are a bubbling undercurrent in everything happening.
Is this the first time the phrase White Walker has been used in the book?
Maybe.
I think so far it's only been like the others or the dead. I really don't think anybody has said White Walker until this chapter, because Nan says White Walkers and then Bran goes, you mean the others? Like, I don't think he's even familiar with that term.
I wonder if it was used at the Wall. I don't know definitively, but
Okay.
they are becoming more and more explicit within the narrative. Not just
Definitely.
within discussion, but in this mythology. There's this shadowy presence that they have in the background of every scene now. I thought that was brought to new heights in the last chapter with the Targaryen checkpoint. We talked about this possible endgame tease with the White Walkers, with the dragons, with the ice and fire sort of combat at the end of all things. That's escalated here even further. And I'm starting to worry about that escalation.
Okay.
Because eventually, sure, Jon's going to go beyond the Wall, but, Hard Home is season 5.
Right.
That's a while down the line.
We got some time before that happens, yeah.
So how does this ramp up of White Walker presence within the story, which is not going to be paid off for thousands of pages?
Time, yeah.
How does this resolve? Because I don't remember White Walkers being introduced in the prologue, and then they're talked about a ton, and then they just slowly fade into the back burner.
I feel like on the show, what I remember happening is every now and then you get a cold open where you see the White Walkers slowly moving. But other than that, I think really what ends up happening is that all just gets put on hold when the War of the Five Kings breaks out.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's what's going to happen is like Westeros problems are going to take precedent. Dany's going to get stuck in Karth for way too long, right? Like, that all has to get put on hold. I mean, I don't think it's never mentioned again. Of course it is. We know like Dany's going to see this winter in her vision at the House of the Undying, and we're going to keep seeing Jon exploring the Wall. I think he meets the wildlings in Clash of Kings.
But they never encounter, like Sam and Gilly encounter White Walkers. Is that the first specific encounter we have with them?
When I do know that when they go to see Craster in Clash of Kings, which I think is early on, remember he's like donating his sons to the White Walkers. So we're going to see that then.
But that's 60 chapters from now.
That's true.
So I just wanted to flag this because I think there's a danger here in trying to keep a drum roll going for 600 pages. And we were already talking about fellowships before, so I had Lord of the Rings on the mind because I think that is sort of the gesture, the tip of the hat that's happening with that last hero male ideal. The White Walker equivalent in Lord of the Rings would be the Nazgul. And the Black Riders,
I suppose, yeah. Or just like Sauron taking over.
Well, judging by Fellowship, not the entire thing, it's the Black Riders.
Okay, yeah.
And they have a really profound appearance and impact early on.
Yeah, they do.
And I guess you could say we had that in the prologue, but it's weird that now they're just benched for a whole book.
But we do have something like there's I didn't talk about this in the recap, but there's all this talk about Benjen Stark being missing and assuming that like the others got him. And so that's like a real threat right now.
Yeah, but that's like a Lovecraftian, someone disappeared and there might be something in the fog that we'll never see.
Yeah, no, you're right.
I don't know. Like is there another equivalent here to the Black Riders? Because if you just watch Fellowship, they're the main antagonists,
right?
And there are chases throughout that movie.
Well, I mean, that's the difference in this story is that the enemy is not just the supernatural creature against the humans; it's all the humans are enemies to one another.
Right.
So
yeah, I'm worried about the lack of resolution or satisfaction with this ongoing hype for White Walkers.
I suppose we'll just keep an eye on it and see if it gets old or dull. I have a random question.
Okay.
Because I didn't know what to do about this. When Tyrion gets there and Maggie, the wolves, they're not dogs. Why do I keep saying that? The wolves all, attack Tyrion or try to attack Tyrion. Why does that happen? Like, what do you think that is? Like, because Theon comments, I don't think they like your smell. And, that's okay. But they've met him before. He's been there before. They didn't go after any of the other Lannisters or anybody else who was there when they were visiting King's Landing. What's the point of that scene? Like, what is it accomplishing? Because it's, like, I guess interesting, but nothing happens and ultimately, like nothing comes of it. So why have that in there?
I think in the room, it's just interpreted as part of the Stark-Lannister rivalry. But I think that moment is for the audience. And I think it's an extension of what I talked about earlier with Tyrion being treated like all the other Lannisters. I think this is a callback for the reader to Joffrey getting mauled by one of the direwolves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I totally forgot about that.
I think that's what it is.
That makes sense.
It's us seeing him being treated like that, even if Rob and Bran and everyone in the room doesn't make that connection too.
Because I was also wondering, like, do the wolves somehow know that the knife belonged to Tyrion. Like,
no.
They don't have that kind of, they have great instincts, but they don't have supernatural
They're
knowledge.
not prescient, no.
Right. So I was just wondering about that. So I guess you have answered that.
That's the most I can make out of that moment.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting.
I think it also breaks the tension. It sort of shocks Robb and Tyrion to back off of their inherited resentment of the other family.
Yeah,
when then
true.
they have to look at each other as individuals and realize, I think you're all right.
Right.
Thanks for doing that thing for my brother.
It also, I mean, what it also demonstrates is that all three of the wolves will do exactly as their owner, like as their masters say.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like even 3-year-old Rickon can say, you know, Shaggy Dog, come home. And he's like, okay, you know, like that's interesting. But it just felt like such an important moment that I didn't really see why it was important. And I was curious about that. I'd love to hear from other people too. Let me know what y'all think, because that's an interesting thing that happened.
My last point, I wanted to go back to my own little meatball I threw out there last week. I talked about Dany. It felt like she was chosen by the dragons. And I was talking about them as possibly being demons and Faustian.
Yes.
Because she's at her lowest. She summons them, but it's less intentional than that. Right? She's not a theologian who decides to try to summon a demon.
Right. She's not like, I'm going to make a deal with the devil now. Like, that's not what happens.
She has a dream, and then the dragons seem to start waking up within the eggs.
Right. And she's just trying to survive.
But she's not culpable in the same way you could argue Faustus is for what happens to him. She's chosen by the dragons. And in a similar way, coming into this chapter, I sensed sort of a reverse echo. We talk about the resonance of Targaryen checkpoints, those chapters reflecting what came before and setting a tone, especially for the subconscious themes of what's going to happen in the following chapters. So I wanted to kind of keep that rolling here, because I can emphasize the same connection between the Starks and their direwolves as you can the Targaryens and their dragons. Similarly, we know from the second chapter of this book, where the Starks discover these direwolves, that they don't intentionally summon them either. Like Dany doesn't do a prayer ritual to get dragons. The Starks just stumble across a dead direwolf, and there are some pups, and they lift them up and they count them, and then they keep them.
That's very true. They kind of like decide, okay, yeah, this might be a good thing to have, but yet they're not like, I think it's time to call upon the direwolves. Yeah.
And I think it's our job, because we've been familiar with this series for so long, to try to kind of goose ourselves and make this fresh again and ask questions, even if we might know the answers to them. So in the same way, last week we tried to look at dragons as possible demons and draw that Faustus connection, see what the danger is of having these things. Is there a chance here to look at the wolves the same way? To compare not just the wolves to the dragons as being sigils, but also as being the payment at the other end of this Faustian bargain. Because when you look at the wolves as possible demons, then I start to see Winterfell as this kind of haunted, empty place. It starts to feel more like how Bram Stoker drew his castles in Dracula, where you have the wolves baying outside constantly as these like demonic forces and vampires arise within.
Do you remember the line, you broke this down in the last Ned chapter, the icy hell, I think, the frozen hell?
Oh, yeah.
So you could make, like, Winterfell could be this frozen hell that's full of these wolf demons, right?
To answer your question, of course I don't remember that, but
you did
I'm glad you do.
You did a whole analysis of this line of Ned's, and I was like, I don't know how to do this. You're like, I know exactly what to do with this. And you did a whole breakdown of Ned's character. It was fascinating.
Every episode is the first episode for me. That's the fun of this.
Starting fresh every time.
Clean slate.
That works. That's really interesting.
Yep.
And I mean, and it's like thinking about Lady and Nymeria, because those wolves are gone now. Lady has been killed and Nymeria has been forced to run away. So how does that work as them being these sort of bargaining chips or forms of payment for the two Stark girls? I don't really know.
I guess they're out of their contract. They're free agents again.
Yeah, I guess so. Or no, it's not that they are helpless without them, because they end up surviving longer than Robb, who has his wolf the whole time. You know, so that's interesting. I guess I want to chew on that and think about it and consider it as we move forward.
I think if we are to graft the Faustian framework onto some of these characters, I think the shakeup is that there's much more power in the conjurer than in the summoned.
Yes, I think you're definitely right there.
So I'm not looking for actual demons in the dragons or the wolves, but instead of I'm paying much more attention to the Faustus characters.
I like that. I like that
which is a good way to make things feel fresh again.
I mean, yeah, I guess in a way, like, Sansa is having to pay by, like, her actions indirectly lead to the murder of her demon, of her wolf, right? And so she is now having to basically suffer those consequences and has to really go through a big journey of becoming a better person than she is right now, because she's kind of being, you know, a little shit.
Yeah.
And then, like, Arya, in a different way, she's had to banish her demon and banish her wolf, and so sort of grow out of that and not rely on it anymore. So there's stuff there.
There's a literal element to Faustus summoning the demon and how Mephistopheles changes his life. But I think the richness of that story is how it furthers his character and his character arc.
Right.
And in the same way, the dragons being summoned sort of liberated Dany, and it gave her that It's a Wonderful Life moment where she could refocus how she was looking at her life and take charge of things a different way, force change her perspective. I think the wolves have had a similar impact on the Stark kids, where sometimes they literally save them in the way that Bran was saved by the wolf intervening when that assassin was trying to take him out, but also the way the wolves have helped the kids mature. If you look at the way they cling to them and hold them when they're scared, or how the way that Arya's relationship, she's been forced to mature because of what happened to her wolf.
Right.
They become catalysts for characterization, and in the end of it, that is what the demons are for Faustus. It's a metaphor. It's an inciting incident.
Yeah.
So I think that's the lens where I think we can make something fruitful out of this comparison.
I like that. That's really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, fun chapter.
That was fun.
I'm really enjoying. I was worried that it was going to feel like too much kind of dual wielding Game of Thrones and Fire and Blood, but I'm finding the resonance incredibly rewarding.
Right, and they're at such different paces too. Yeah, so it's a different experience doing both of these at the same time.
I would again urge you, if you're excited for House of the Dragon and you've read Fire and Blood, or you want, our recap and discussion and analysis, the thing we do here, go check that out over on the Patreon. $2 a month, you support the show and you get that. It's basically going to be coming out weekly until the show comes back. So that's a ton of bonus content.
Yeah, usually we do one bonus episode a month, and this time we're doing like 4 because we want to get these out before season 2 starts. So we'll check it out.
The train keeps a rolling. Thank you very much for listening and for supporting the show. And we'll be back here. Well, this is coming out on Friday, so we'll be back in 2 days with a Fire and Blood episode over on Patreon, and then on Tuesday for another Curveball episode.
Awesome.
Thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Bye.